Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. I'd like to take a quick break from this conversation to make our listeners aware of a new series of introductory webinar-style courses. These one-hour courses are designed to help parents and teachers become familiar with the liberal arts tradition. If you would like to know more about classical education and experience the joy and the beauty of this tradition, join us for our Snapshot series. Currently, our snapshots of the great conversations, as well as snapshots of the literary tradition, are open for registration. Each class is a standalone class and is only 1 hour. Take one or take them all. For up-to-date course lists, you can visit us at beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. Again, beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com, and look for our snapshot series to see what might interest you. Thank you for listening, and now let's return to the show. Today, my special guest is Karen Swallow Pryor. You may have heard of her. She's an author of a very good book that I read called On Reading Well. And I just want to welcome Karen to our show today and have her open with telling us a little bit about herself and her work as a teacher and an author. Welcome to the show, Karen.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to talk with you. So my background is that I have a PhD in English. I went to a state university where there isn't a lot of study of classical texts. And I actually went at a time, it's been a long time now, but I went at a time when literary criticism was was everything, and modern and postmodern literature. And it was really kind of a shock to me because I majored in English and I pursued, a graduate degree in English because I just love reading. I love books. And here I was in this program where it was all about the different literary theories and just I love, critiquing and analyzing text, but it was so politicized and just sort of ripped the text apart. And it didn't seem like anyone there really just loved to read the books. And so I had to kind of hang on to that during that time. And as one does, find the professors that just really spoke more to my interests and my love for literature. And so I survived and got my PhD and began teaching full-time in my first academic position at Liberty University, which is an evangelical school, probably not known for its classical education. But of course, we would get a lot of students who come from Christian schools, classical Christian schools, homeschooling, which is, a lot of homeschoolers are really emphasizing classical education now. So kind of through my students, I got introduced to this approach, love those students. And of course now, classical schools are opening everywhere. There's one in, my area. So I know those teachers. Some of my former students are those teachers. And I've been able to speak at some of the conferences for classical Christian schools, and eventually wrote my book on Reading Well, which is out almost 5 years now, where I learned, in the process of writing this book, more about classical education and philosophy, but also just get to draw on what I said earlier. I just loved from the beginning, great literature. Not necessarily, the ancient stuff is what we really consider classic is good, but I think that there's a lot that we can see in even more modern literature that draws on some of those classical principles. And so that was the impetus of my book on Reading Well.
Yeah, I really, really enjoy that book. And I actually just bought the audiobook, and the lady who does the reading of the book is great. She did a great job.
I never listened to it, so great to hear.
It's actually really good. And I don't buy an audiobook unless the reader is good, because I have trouble listening. But Yeah, I feel like from reading on Reading Well, it's a very beneficial book for our listeners, for any of our audience who hasn't read that book yet. I highly recommend it. I think it's very valuable for classical educators, especially English teachers. I kind of want to go back a little bit on what you said with your experience in college was the critical theory. How do you speak about that and like explain, because some not every one of our listeners knows what that means, so explain the difference between the critical theory and this idea of reading well that you're talking about.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And actually, my undergraduate college was wonderful. They really helped develop my love of literature. It was really the going to get a PhD that in the PhD program where it was a different approach. So,
Mm.
literary criticism has a long history. We actually, I mean, the first real literary critic was Aristotle, who wrote Poetics, and I am very influenced by Aristotle's Poetics and his ethics, and so it's literary criticism or in literary theory aren't really new things, but in really in the 20th century, there was a whole sort of industry of competing schools of criticism, some emphasizing um, sort of the text itself and just looking at that as a work of art, and some sort of in a counter swing looking at the context, the author's life, and all of those things. And these are all very interesting things. But then also, especially in the latter part of the 20th century, because of currents going on in philosophy, particularly French philosophy, around language and words. A lot of theories about language and words themselves developed, like deconstruction, post structuralism, and then a lot of political theories like Marxism and feminism. Now, I think all of these are interesting tools, and some of them do give us, different ways of looking at the literature, and I'm happy to draw from them all. What I was experiencing, and I actually, this is just kind of a tide that I think has gone out now. I mean, it's corrected itself, but there was just so much emphasis on the theory and on the criticism and less on the text itself. And I think that's, as in all things, I mean, this is, my book on reading well is about virtue. And virtue, no matter what we're talking about, is avoiding an excess or a deficiency. So I think a virtuous reader, this isn't really this topic of this book, but it's a great question. A virtuous reader can look at a work of literature through various angles and be enlightened by those, including, the author's life, the historical context, the cultural context, but also let's just enjoy the text, enjoy the story. So I think a balanced approach is one that's the most enriching when we're reading literature.
Yeah, that's really, really good. I definitely picked up that message in on Reading Well. And what I want to talk about today as well is your new book, The Evangelical Imagination, that you sent me so graciously. And I'm really enjoying it. Uh, I, as I'm reading through it, and I'm not done with it yet, but I will say that you have intrigued me enough with where I'm at in the book that I want to finish it. So,
Well, that's what an author wants to hear. Yes.
yeah, yes, it is very good. And so there's a lot of interesting ideas in here. And what I realized, I don't know, maybe about 30 or 40 pages into it was, oh, this almost feels like a sequel to On Reading Well. It almost feels like you came across something when you were working on the On Reading Well project, the book, that sort of sparked your, I don't know, sparked you to think, oh, here's an idea that somebody needs to write about that's never been written about. And so, I mean, I could be wrong, but that's kind of how I felt going into it, was that you were inspired as you were doing your work for the other book to write this book. Can you tell us a little bit of background about it, and what did inspire you, if I'm not right? What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I think you're partly right. So yeah, so I mean, on reading well is very much about how to read literature well, and that's a very cognitive, rational, intellectual endeavor that we have to do intentionally and consciously. Think about a work of literature, which I love to do, and I teach literature, so I do a lot of that. But at the same time, there's a way that literature operates that is not cognitive, it's not intellectual, it's not just rational. There's an aesthetic element to it. So we can give a summary of a great novel or a great epic on Wikipedia. They're out there. And you can kind of get the idea of what happens. But that is not the work of literature, right? The work of literature is also has a form, and it's you experience something through that form, and that's the part that sometimes we can't necessarily put into words. We can analyze it and figure out how it happens, but there is an aesthetic element to all art and really all of life. And I think that's where the imagination comes in, right? Because imagination, kind of strictly speaking, is just our ability to make images. Okay, it's something that helps define us as humans. I don't think my dogs, well, they do dream, I guess. I see them, their legs kicking around, but they don't have an abstract kind of imagination like we do. And what feeds and forms our imagination? Obviously, when we read books and look at art, it does, but that's not the only thing. Our imagination is being shaped by the things that we perceive, our perceptions. And what there can be, 100 things around us at any given moment, but we aren't really perceiving them if we're not paying attention to them. And so my launch, into what became the Evangelical Imagination was formed in that way that you describe. But also, and I talk about this a little bit in the short introduction, because I was teaching in an evangelical context, and for 22 years I taught in that context and got lots of students who came from that background and that culture. I would, because of my specialty is 18th and 19th century British literature, I taught a lot of Victorian literature. And a lot of my students, when we're reading this Victorian literature, which has, reflects the culture, obviously, and has many wonderful things about it, it also has sort of a seedy, dark underside to it, and some excesses in that period. And so a lot of my students started noticing, especially when the Victorian literature would talk about express its views of women, or the private realm versus the public realm, the emphasis on sexual purity for women but not so much for men. A lot of these aspects that we read about in Victorian literature, my students said, wait, that sounds like my household and my church in the 21st century. And so I said, okay, so let's just sort of unpack what ideas that are part of this culture are really and truly biblical and can be supported by a Christian worldview, and what ones just kind of came to us from the culture that we inherited and we were told were Christian, but maybe just really are more Victorian. So that was the other stream that brought about this book.
Yeah, very interesting. I want, if it's okay, I want to read a section that really struck me and I really liked it. It's on page 15 of the book, and the title of this section is called The Imagination and the Social Imagery. You say, and you're kind of reflecting back to what you had just said, but it's not as important to the point I'm going to make. You say, as examined above, imagination as a reflection of God's image in all human beings is suggestive for how we treat the work of our own and others' individual imaginations. Our own individual imaginations create dreams for the future, plans for our next vacation, conjectures about the meeting our boss asked to have tomorrow, and countless works of music, poetry, and art. Collectively, the works of our imagination reflect and create cultures. And I got the idea that as I kept reading, your part of your thesis is this idea about how imagination reflects and creates cultures, which is fascinating. And I love how you unpack all of this. For our listeners, could you talk a little bit about what you mean when you say collectively the work of our imagination reflects and creates cultures?
Yes, that is really an important question, because the title of my book might be a little bit misleading, because of course I am talking about the imagination and imaginative works, but I'm really talking about them in this context that you just read a key line, and that is what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls a social imaginary. So an imaginary, as Taylor defines it, is a pool of images and stories, myth, legends, visions for the good life, that we have shared and developed together as a culture, that we've inherited, but often they're just assumed and we don't examine them. They've been handed down to us. For example, like as I talked about earlier, sort of the idea that a woman is supposed to be the angel in the house, or even if we don't use that term or know that poem, which was very popular and famous in the Victorian age, we still might have inherited that idea, and it might be lurking underneath, driving us and motivating us and casting visions for what we think the future should be or what life should be, without really knowing that it's there. And that's what the book is really about, is that collective pool of stories and images and concepts that we've inherited. Some of them, most can be very rooted in truth and goodness and be right. Yet if we don't examine them, and we leave something out, or they become distorted or excessive or deficient, then they can become harmful.
Well, I really appreciated the ideas that language and imagination influence each other in order to create culture. Um, I want to talk a little bit about that more, and how you think, I mean, Chris, you're starting to go there, but I want to go a little deeper. How you think what are the implications for how we teach students and how we relate to one another with this
Mm.
idea?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I think that I guess maybe I'll just answer that question by talking about how this worked for me as someone who grew up loving to read and loving
Mm-hmm.
to learn about literature, and I saw a lifetime of reading stories, good, bad, classical, new, widened my perspective. It helped give me insight into how other people might think or what their perspectives might be. We all know this. But as it does that, it also, and maybe we just need to be intentional about this, it also, if we ask questions about why these things were in this world, that we're reading about, or why the characters acted this way, and they do that without really even thinking about it or articulating it, we can see that we do the same thing. And so, a really good example of this from what I would consider classical literature is my one of my all-time favorites, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, right? So that famous opening line, "It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man with a fortune must be in want of a wife." I think I got that pretty close. Um, if we understand the book, and we do need to understand it, we understand that that's a satirical line. Like, not everyone agrees with that line. It is not a truth universally acknowledged, but that line is a perfect example of how a social imaginary works, because it is exposing that in this particular culture and society, there are expectations about what a woman needs. There are expectations about what a single man with a fortune should want or need, whether he wants to or not, and how that's all going to play out. And so the only way a line like that could be said, which is really kind of expressing the view of Mrs. Bennet, is if Mrs. Bennet has been formed by a social imaginary in which men and women and money operate this way. That's never said, but that's what's underneath the surface. And we're no different from Mrs. Bennet. We have like underlying thoughts, expectations, beliefs, visions for the good life that might be perfectly fine, or they could be distorted and not really the best, or not complete anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that what you're saying too really drives home the importance of reading good
Mhm.
books. Like, this is the essence of a classical education, and why we read these good books is because it does shape us and form us, even inadvertently. Like,
Yeah.
inadvertently, the virtues, The vice is they're going to come through the story organically,
Yes.
and they are
Yes.
absolutely going to shape our character, our imagination without direct. You don't even have to do the direct instruction or the didactic teaching of the virtues. What are the virtues?
Right.
The power of story. I think this is what I hear you saying, that the power of story is so strong. The images that it puts in us are so strong that they drive our culture. They drive our views of life. And so, like, just having this conversation about this just really drives home the idea of how important books are and why we do need to be careful with what books we are giving to our children to read and making sure that we're reading good literature to give them an experience of the best in what we have from authors and artists and music. And Plato said the same thing. He said, we want to give children the best, right?
Right.
And I think in within the best, there's going to be ugly things. There's
Right.
it's
Right. It's not about just the content being all Pollyanna and rosy.
right.
It's really about the quality of the way the story is told. Right.
Yes. I mean, we could talk about, like, even To Kill a Mockingbird and how influential that book was on our culture. Did you bring that one up in the book? Because I haven't finished the book
Yeah,
yet.
no, I didn't. Part of what I'm doing in the book, it's not entirely negative, but but it's easier to sort of show what I'm talking about through negative examples. And so, To Kill a Mockingbird is like a positive example. The example I do bring up that had a similar role in an earlier time was Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Uncle Tom's Cabin was hugely influential in culture. There's a whole like urban legend about, President Lincoln calling, saying to Harriet Beecher Stowe, she's the little lady that started that war, which we don't know if that really happened, but it kind of captures the essence of the power of that story. And yet what I talk about in this is yes, this novel did move people's hearts. It helped open people's eyes to the horrors and evils of slavery, but it also did so in a way that had a cost of its own because it's kind of a sentimental novel. It's really not a great work of literature. So it's a good example of how a story can move people, but if it's distorted or slanted in some excessive way, and in this case, in being overly sentimental to the point that many of the African Americans that it depicts in their lives is kind of is sentimentalized, and they're even, some would say, dehumanized. So it kind of gave with one hand and took away with another because it was based on simply moving the emotions, which is easy to do, but moving the emotions and the heart and the mind all in the right direction, that's what the greatest literature does.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting, and I didn't get it until I got to like the third chapter, and then I was like, oh, I see what she's doing. I
That's
love.
okay, because I was building up, so you were
Okay.
right on time.
Well, so what I saw was this metaphoric, the evangelical metaphoric patterns is what I started to notice. I was like, oh, I get it now. Okay, so you're these evangelical patterns of having an awakening, a conversion, a testimony. And I thought this was a really interesting way to organize this book. How did you come up with that? It was really awesome.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I had these different, as I'm sort of thinking about a book like this one, I had certain chapters and ideas in mind. And then ordering them really was, some of it seemed pretty logical. I mean, I knew that a central chapter that I would have would be conversion. And what happened when I was, because for anyone who doesn't know, the famous Bebington Quadrilateral, which is the definition of evangelicalism for 300 centuries, has four points, and one of them is conversionism, evangelicals' emphasis on conversion. So I had to do that, of course. And what happened when I was writing the chapter and researching the chapter on conversion is I realized, wait a minute, there's something that comes before conversion and there's something that comes after. And so I started to see a pattern where I could order the chapters almost along the way of an individual person going through a faith journey, like birth is an awakening, then conversion, and then a testimony, and then the strive for improvement, and so on and so
Well,
forth.
I really loved how you pulled in so many literary examples within these metaphors of being an evangelical. Like you start off, chapter 1 is called Made in His Image. Of course, that's where you would start. And then I love the Awakening chapter a lot.
Oh,
That
it's very
chapter,
literary.
it's beautiful. And then you go on through testimony, improvement, you're growing in your faith. And then you end with Reformation and Rapture, which I'm excited to get to. But I really think that this idea of this metaphor, this evangelical metaphor, to sort of walk through your point about imagination is really, really a very interesting, brilliant approach. And I really appreciate it. What was your favorite chapter to write?
Oh, wow. All right. So my favorite chapter to write was the one on sentimentality. So, because obviously I teach literature and teach good literature, and I appreciate art and good art. And yet here I am. I'm an evangelical, and so if you know anything about that, you know that I'm surrounded by a lot of less than good art and music and fiction and so on. Now there's some good stuff out there, but we know it's so prevalent that it's kind of a cliche that just the Christian movies and Christian music is not that great, and there are a number of reasons. And books have been written on this. I only have a chapter. There are a number of reasons why in this modern age, because in ages past, of course, Christians produced some of the world's greatest art and music and literature. But now we tend not to, at least evangelicals. And so I actually care about this issue a lot, and I talk about it a lot, and I boil it down to one main weakness is our tendency towards sentimentality. And so I give the example of Thomas Kincaid and his paintings of light, which are very comforting and sweet, but really don't do what good art should do, which is to kind of wrestle and reflect the realities of life in some way, not just comfort and mollify.
I love that you're bringing up this idea that we are surrounded by modern art that isn't so great. And one of the people who reviewed your books, and I'm not the artist, and I'm not seeing his name. You know who I'm
Makoto
talking about?
Fujimura, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I love I can never say his name. Can you say it again?
Makoto Fujimura.
Thank you. I've never heard it said. But I started following him years ago when he did his illustrations for the anniversary edition of the Bible. Um, and he is a modern living artist who I think does beautiful, just absolutely breathtaking work. And I could see the beauty in it just from pictures online. And I started following his work it was really years ago. It was right when he was starting to come out with his when they were announcing this Bible that was about to come out. And I was like, well, now there's a modern artist that I like, but he's using ancient techniques when he's with his modern art. And so in the curriculum I've written for some schools I worked for, I had a lesson in there about beauty and viewing art and the difference between beautiful art and this modern, what I don't know why we're calling it art, but but the idea that what he produces is a good model of, I think, modern art. And I ended up at the Bible Museum in DC, and his works are there, and I didn't know they were going to be there, and I was so excited I started crying. And his works in person are even more beautiful. So I was very excited that he reviewed your book.
I was very honored because he is clearly one of the leading and most excellent Christian artists alive today, and his work is beautiful, and his and it's not just his work, his life, his ministry, his presence. This, as you said, he is a model for all of us, whether even if we're not artists. He is a model for us.
Yeah, and I'm going to put a link to his work in our show notes. Excellent. For sure. So, how do you think this book, and I do think that this book would be helpful for teachers, especially at private Christian, evangelical Christian classical schools. How do you think that this book would be helpful for teachers and leaders in those schools?
That's a great question because, of course, I'm focusing on evangelicalism, and I know that not all classical Christian educators and students are necessarily in that tradition, but they probably, interact with it a lot. What I really hope for this book, and I think, is the same thing that I would hope for that would be especially helpful in a classical Christian school context, is my examples are very limited, and I'm drawing from talking about this idea within a very particular audience. But what I'm trying to do is actually model, to use that word again, model what it looks like to examine our underlying assumptions that we've left unexamined. And there is no one social imaginary. There's no one evangelical social imaginary. There are imaginaries, all, inherited ideas and concepts and visions of the good life. And we ought to think about, what stories are driving us, what images are driving us. And you might be part of a community that has different ones than the ones I identify. All I want to do in this book is talk about this community that I'm writing about, but even more than that, show how we can all do this. We can all look at the stories, images, and metaphors that are shaping us, and ask, like, well, is this a true, good, and beautiful story, metaphor, or image, or is it lacking in some way? How can we recover it, or should it be recovered?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's good. That's really good. And I want to get to your heart as a teacher in the classroom, because I love to talk to teachers in our podcast. I know we have a lot of teachers that are new to classical education. Um, from your love of teaching, you clearly love teaching, and I would love to take a class from you. Can you just talk to our teachers about what is the best way to approach literature as a
Mm.
teacher?
Oh, I love this question. I don't think anyone's even asked me this of all the podcasts and interviews I do. But of course, this is your heart too, and the heart of your listeners. And again, so because I have taught so many generations or decades of students who come from secondary schools into the college classroom, I get to see the best and the worst of what happens to them in those earlier classrooms. And the one thing that I would say that we all need to do more is to, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, so pardon me if I don't say anything revolutionary. So maybe I'm just affirming is we need to, like, slow down and really engage with the text. One of the things that I do in my classes, and I do it more and more. I'm actually leaving teaching and entering full-time writing at this moment. So but I'll still be teaching in a different form. But more and more, especially because we're in the digital age, I'm realizing that even my students who are English majors who love to read don't read well. And so I need to model it for them in the classroom. And what that means is, together, just opening up the text and sitting down with a passage or a line. One of my favorite teaching experiences in the last several years was teaching a women's literature course. And I was teaching Jane Eyre, a book I've read and
That's my
reread.
favorite.
Okay, go. Go. I am preaching to the choir. We spent probably 20 minutes on the first line. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We just sat on that line and talked about what it's saying, what it's drawing from, the journey metaphor, the limits, like what was going on. And we just got so much out of that one line. Now, I know we can't, spend the whole school year doing this, but I realized more and more that students, even students who want to love to read, are ill-equipped to do it because they're in such a hurry. Another time recently, I was just, I don't even think it was a sign, but for some reason I was just like, oh, we need to read this poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins. And it wasn't even one of his most difficult ones, of course, because he invents words and makes them up. But there were some words he was using that aren't the most common words. But many people would still know them. And so I asked my students, I said, so what does this word mean? And they all said, I don't know. And I would say, yes, you do. Like think about, the etymology, think about the root word. And they would say, oh yeah. And then sometimes I would say, no, I don't. I said, well, pull out your phone and look it up. And they would look up the word, and all of a sudden the light bulbs would go on. Like a poem really comes alive when you know what the words mean. And that sounds so basic, but we skip over, we live in a culture in which we just aren't, trained and disciplined to not skip over and to just think about the words. And this goes back to your point earlier about, why reading it is so formative, whether we realize it or not, is because we are creatures of language. So
Right.
words and like we traffic in words all day long. And we come home and we talk about how our day went. We're using words, and we could, two people could have been in the same car, having the same experience, and they come home and they could tell the story in entirely different ways because they saw different things, they interpreted it differently. But we're doing that through words, and the way we tell the story is the way we're understanding reality, and we use words to do that. And so we really, anything we can do to get students and ourselves more attentive to what words are saying and how they're doing it. And that requires slowing down and teaching them and modeling it for them. I think they think that the better we are at literature, it's like the faster we go, we just zip along. No, 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 no. The better we are, the more we're just slowing down and saying, wow, look at the power of this word. How is this word operating? And what is it doing to us? And what is it teaching us? So, okay. Yeah.
No,
That was
that's
a lot.
great. That's so good. That's exactly right. And I think that what you're doing in slowing down and appreciating it with the students the way you describe is you are experiencing the literature as a work of art. And
Mm,
I think that is the right way to approach reading. I mean, C.S. Lewis in his Experiment in Criticism, that's kind of what the whole book is about,
right.
is approaching literature as a work of art. And I think that if teachers can begin to wrap their mind around what that really means,
Mhm,
that
mhm,
it will make for better teachers. Um, and I think you're right. Modeling. I know I was had an interview with Joshua Gibbs a couple of months ago. One of our episodes, we talked about Jane Eyre as well. And he reads. He says we just read the books aloud in class,
mm.
and then we stop and talk about it. Okay, what does this mean? And a good teacher isn't going to lecture what it means. A good teacher is going to say, okay, what is this saying, right? And
Right.
I think that's what I
Model what what we're doing when we read it. Right.
right, and modeling a conversation about this. Right.
Mhm,
Yeah, I think
mhm.
that's great.
Yeah.
I'm so happy that you said that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
um,
happy you asked.
yeah, that was a good one. So I'm about to wrap up, and what I like to do with our guests is to ask them to share either a quote that has had a big impact on your life, or a book that you had wish you had read sooner and why.
Okay, that's a great question. And I think the first thing that comes to my mind is a book that I read just really in the past, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, that I had never read before. And I was stunned with how beautiful it was. So I'll tell you the book and then maybe reflect a little on why I wish I'd read it earlier. It was John Steinbeck's East of Eden. And, I got turned off of American literature in college because of Moby Dick. That's a whole other story.
Oh,
I'm reading, yeah.
that's I am actually reading Moby Dick right now for the
I am
first time.
too. I am too. Oh, we are like soulmates. We love Jane Eyre. We're reading Moby Dick for the first time. I know. And it's just, it was a
And
lifelong.
I actually really am enjoying it. And I have a very good audiobook. I'll send you
Oh, okay, okay.
the reader is good.
I'm remembering why I did. It's better, of course, better than I thought it was when I didn't read
Hmm.
it in college when I was supposed to. But I was just like, well, I just turned to British literature at that point, and
Right.
so there's a lot of American literature that I haven't read, and East of Eden was just stunning and beautiful. And maybe if I'd read it earlier, I wouldn't have been ready for it or whatever. But I think if I'd read it a little bit earlier, I would. What I really loved about it is not only that it's just a great story that's well told, but I love how it retells the biblical stories. And the great Old Testament stories. It just sort of resets them in that time and place. And for me, the way it blended modern literature and America and the Bible is sort of a seamless whole, a seamless vision of the human condition. I think I would have appreciated American literature more, appreciated, you can always appreciate the Bible more. I've just always been more drawn to literature. And I don't know, it was just a stunning and beautiful work that moved me. And maybe I read it at the right time in my life, but it is one that I think if I had been introduced to it earlier, I would have had broader literary taste than I do now, which they're fairly broad, but they could be broader.
Mhm. All right. Well, thank you, Karen, for this your time. And I really hope our listeners will go out and get a copy of either On Reading Well or The Evangelical Imagination or both and get to know you. I think that your heart shines through these books, and I really I like you.
Oh, thank you. We had a rough start on this podcast, but we both persevered through the technology issues, and I just had such an enjoyable conversation. I'm so glad that we got past the gremlins, and did. It
In
was
our
great.
microphones, right?
Yes, yes.
All right. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com/support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."